Big thanks to all our sponsors, Skips and Bins. You can find them at skipsandbins.com or telephone 0800 25 45 25 3. Email inquiries at skipsandbins.com. Website skipsandbins.com. Easy contract free and pay-as-you-go waste collection. Big thanks to Mr. Vicky's sauces handmade in Cumbria. You can order them from their website, mrvickys.co.uk, or by telephoning 01768 210 102. A big thanks also to New Workwear. You can find them at newworkwear.com. They're an agile and dedicated workwear provider. Welcome back as well to United Travel. They are a UK coaches firm and they are based in the Northeast. They've got 2024 tours and you can contact them on 01670 632 460 or mobile 0791 666 4174. Email info@unitedgrouptravel.com and they've got a website which is unitedgrouptravel.com. There's no strangers on their tours, just people you haven't met yet. Big thanks to them for their sponsorship. Big thanks as well to Media Arts, and they supply all the video technology. If you want to become a member and get a cup, a pen, a membership card, and a scarf, then get your smartphone and put it over this QR code. It will take you straight to the membership pack. It's a £25 one-off fee. You can also go to NUFC Matters website and search membership pack to book today. If you want to help the channel, then subscribe to it by hitting the subscribe button. Hit the thumb up under the video to like the video and click share to share to your other social media. We're also available as a podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and other podcast providers. Don't forget, we help the food bank on this channel. If you want to do so virtually, go to nufcfansfoodbank.co.uk and make a donation today. The Alan Shearer raffle is back on. 150 tickets, £1 a ticket. Win a limited edition signed Alan Shearer ball. Enter today at nufcmatters.com.
Critics attack. It feels like I've been talking to myself again. But it's the only way you're ever gonna learn. You look back and it's all in the past. I'm dwelling on the thoughts I cannot say to you. If I don't say the words, then maybe it's not true.
Good morning, welcome to NUFC Matters. It is the Eddie Howe press conference review for the Liverpool game tomorrow, 4:30 kickoff at St James's Park in the Premier League. And as always, Matthew Raisbeck started it off. The questions with Eddie, talking about Lewis Hall, the acquisition of Lewis Hall. And he said he played against us a couple of times last season. He really impressed me and the coaching staff. And we watched a lot of Chelsea last season as well. He caught my eye and I liked his attitude and I really think he'll be a good signing, said Eddie. Razor pressed him on Hall and said the fact that Hall has played in a variety of positions at Chelsea was the versatility of the player the key and reason for bringing him in. And he went, yeah, look, he's got attributes. He's played many different positions at Chelsea. He only converted to left back a year ago, but he has played 4 or 5 different roles. So versatility is obviously part of the reason that he brought him in. Matthew then said he's only 18. You know, what challenges does he have arriving at Newcastle and you know, to find a place in the team? He said short term, he's got to be molded into what we want. And, you know, ideally, he says, as he said before, when you sign a player, you want to get them in early. He says, you look at Tonali, he's benefited from coming in early pre-season. And he says Lewis Hall just needs to do that, to adapt to our ways, to get to that fitness level. But he was then asked if he would be in contention for today's game, and he went, he is fit, and yes, he is contention to be in the squad. So good news, I guess, for Lewis Hall, 18 years of age and already fighting his way into that first team pool. Matthew Raceback then asked about Joe Linton, because obviously he limped off at the Etihad last weekend. He said he trained in the latter part of the week. Fingers crossed he will be okay. Also asked him about Manquillo, who's become a bit of a forgotten man this season. He said he's been abroad for treatment, but he is back with us, and he is somebody who will be available at some point. We'll come to Manquillo a little bit later in the press conference as well. He also asked about having all of these options right and left with the new acquisitions like Livramento, like Lewis Hall, for example. Could Manquillo leave? And he said possibly, but it really depends on what the player wants. We've got a robust season ahead of us, and we need strength in depth. Razor then asked about the game against Liverpool. He says it's a big game. And he went, yeah, he says these games are big. They are iconic. He says last year we were disappointed. Especially down at Anfield with the disallowed goal, and then of course the home game where Nick Pope was sent off and of course cost himself his place in the Wembley Cup final. He did, however, reiterate that he felt that we played well with 10 men, but of course Liverpool doing the double over us last season. Razor then said they've made changes to their squad, quite big changes. What have you observed from that? He said, yeah, there's slight tweaks, but the main principles of Liverpool Football Club are the same. They are going to be difficult to play, and he does believe that Liverpool will come back stronger this season. Mark was next up from Sky. Not heard this guy ask questions before. How much extra value is it when you beat a team like Liverpool, was his question. And he said, yeah, yes and no. He says it's still 3 points, but ultimately, if you do win a game like this, then you feel confident afterwards. The momentum carries for that little bit longer. But he says, of course, you want to do well at home as well, and he says that's good for home supporters. He also then asks Mark about dramatic moments against Liverpool. He says, especially over the last couple of years, can you sum up the relationship between the staff? He was a bit perplexed at this question, and he basically said, look, I've got a huge amount of respect for Jurgen Klopp, but ultimately we are competing against him and his team. And, I view him exactly the same as I view all the other managers in the Premier League. He then asked a question about Bruno and the fallout that we saw online. Bruno, of course, if you haven't realised, did reply to a tweet that was put out by NUFC 360, which led to Bruno replying, then quickly deleting, but by that time it had been screenshotted and the rest is history. He said, has this been a lesson for Bruno and the fans about, how they use social media with regards to the football club? Eddie has always played this with a straight bat, but gave a good answer. He just said, "Look, I'm not going to criticise the supporters." He says it's a lesson for us, and it's a lesson for Bruno. He said it's why I'm not on social media. He says players, of course, can choose whether they're on social media or not. He says, but ultimately, it's why we don't emotionally react to praise or to negativity. He says Bruno's an emotional character and he uses his emotion and that helps him perform well. But he certainly made, a mention of this, on a couple of occasions because he was pressed on it, as you'll see. But, ultimately his get out here was, look, Bruno's learned a lesson, I guess. Slight disappointment at City was Mark's next question. He says, does that show how far you've come? He says, look, I can't look at losing any game as a good result. He says the performance wasn't bad. He says, but certain players in the team as a whole didn't perform at the levels that we're normally used to. Andy Sixsmith was next. Andy, of course, a regular in the press room. He says, did you speak to Bruno about this, or was it just quickly dismissed and you moved on? He says, look, it was a bit of both. He says, people at the club will speak to him, I'm sure. But he says, yeah, we will, we'll move on from this now. Then Andy said, obviously, the signing of Hall is a good one. What did you make of the reaction of his parents, and have you met them? And he said, yeah, I met them the day before he signed. He says, I got the feeling from them of a huge level of support. They're obviously Newcastle fans, and he's in a really good place, and they're going to be very important for him moving forward in his career at Newcastle United. And Andy then said, how good have the transfers been this summer? And he got asked this last week, and he Andy probably forgot, but he sidestepped it, and he sidestepped it again. He said, look, I feel like it's a leading question, Andy. He said, it's how you view them immediately can be one way. He says, and how you view them in history in a couple of years' time can be a different way. He says, so I won't make any opinions on these people now, but I might if I'm still here in 2 years. So Andy said he would ask him in 2 years. Isak's been at the club for a year, said Andy. He said, how close has he come now to fulfilling his potential? And he says, well, he's on his way, but there's room for improvement. He's shown unique qualities. He's got a good goal tally last season for the games that he played. His all-round game has improved. And consistency, though, throughout will be the challenge for him and for everybody in the team. And, that is what, you strive to achieve. And only then, I guess, can you say that you fulfilled your potential. Andy then said, Liverpool, Newcastle, it's a classic. Which game springs to mind? The obvious one, said Eddie. The 4-3, the iconic game. He says, with Kevin Keegan slumped across the billboards, he says, that particular moment in time, he says, has stayed with me forever. And, that, I guess, is everyone's favourite. It was known as the Premier League's greatest game of all time, wasn't it? So no wonder that was the game that he picked out. He went on to say that he's got so much respect for Kevin Keegan. He did back then, he still does now, and for that team. Andy then moved on, with Man City. He said, after Manchester City, didn't bring any points. What does this game look like? He says, look, everything from a St James's Park performance last season is what we're looking for with this Liverpool game. He says, I'm not going to dissect other teams. I'm not going to look at the likes of City and Liverpool and whoever and give you my feeling on those teams, but I can only speak as I find on our team. He then asked about the technical area situation. He says, how are you and Jason Tindall sorting that out? How are you coping with it? He went, I've not really spoken to him about it. He says, but, it's enabled me to drop back at times and look at the screen, things I probably wouldn't have done. And he says, from my point of view, I haven't really struggled. He says, we're finding a way to cope with it. Lee was next, not Lee Ryder, I don't think. He says, Pep was full of praise for you last week. Is that any consolation? He said, in a very, forthright manner, I respect Pep's opinion, but it's just words. It doesn't mean anything. Lee then asked about transfers. He said, you're bringing in players and, those players who can be versatile. Manchester City do that. Is that an important thing in football nowadays to do that? He says, yeah, players who can play in different roles and different positions. It is very important. Again, he said, from your perspective with the Liverpool game coming up, are you, people are saying that you're slight favourites for this. Do you prepare differently? And he went, no, we can only control how we perform and set up. And, he says it's difficult, but he certainly didn't make any confirmation that he felt that, that they were favourites for this game. And why would he? He then basically said, there's energy in both of these midfields. How do you feel the game's going to go? And he went, yeah, look, he says, Liverpool have got a new midfield. We've recruited in that area. He says, our midfield struggled against Manchester City, but everything tells you that it's going to be a classic. Simon was next. He said, after that defeat last week, there was some criticism, because of the levels that you're now at. There's an expectancy. Is it difficult to deal with those expectations? Eddie said, when we lose a game, we are there to be criticised, and handling defeat is part of our job, and we need to be able to cope with that as well as when things are going well. He then was talking about there was another reporter came in, but couldn't get his name. Tried, I couldn't get his name. He says, do you move on quickly from defeats, or do some games haunt you? And he says, personally, I move on quickly. He says, but the memories of games stay with you, both positive and negative. And he says, there are lots of games which I've lost as a manager, which have stayed with me and as a player. And he says, if I think carefully about them, I can bring them back in my mind. The same reporter asked, do you expect a backlash from those teams who were in your weight last season, who didn't finish in the Champions League spots? And he went, I'm not sure backlash is the right word. He says, but there are really good people who work at the other clubs and they'll be motivated to try and outdo us this season. He says, we can only focus on what we do. He says, time will tell. But he says, I like the look of our squad and it's certainly stronger than last year. And this was a bit of a, it was one of those press conferences where the same question was asked in different ways by different journalists. And Eddie, ultimately, had the same answer. Jordan was next. He says, is Lewis Hall the last signing? He went, yes. He answered it last week. He said that is still the case unless there's injuries, maybe to players, two players in the same position. Or any players leaving? Well, of course, you all know now that Fraser's gone to Southampton, but that was where the news was broken. Jordan then asked about Bruno. What's your thoughts on social media? He wanted a wider answer, something we discussed on the Amigos last night. And he said, it's a big one, that. He says, genuinely, I'm not involved in social media. And he says, and that's very intentional. He says, when I was younger, when I was a player, he said, I used to read the papers. I used to read the reviews. And he said, I would read a match report where it praised me and I'd feel great. But I've now got to go and do that again next week. He says, and then I picked up one newspaper where I was, given a bad review. And he says, I made a point of never reading a newspaper review of a game again. So, he says that's why I've never taken to social media. Craig Hope was next. He said, is Bruno back to his best? He went, football's a strange game. He said he was great versus Villa. He was great in training after the Villa game. But he said he was maybe slightly below par against Manchester City, but we were as a team. He says, but Bruno is going to be such an important player for us this year. He then asked him about Klopp. He said, Klopp's been very vocal on everything to do with Newcastle, including your spending power. He said he spent 100 million. He was going to spend 100 million on Caicedo. He says, what do you make about Klopp having a 200 million pound commitment to transfers? And he says, I know what you want me to say, Craig. Everybody then laughed. He says, but that's the dynamic of football fees. He says, they change quickly. He says, but I'd never talk about another club openly, which is, fair play to Eddie. Lee Ryder was next. He says, Fabian Schär went down last week, but had a great game eventually, recovering. Was that a concern for you? He went, yeah. He says, of course it was. He says, you're always 2 injuries away from a crisis. He said, I feared a dislocation, but he got back up and him and Sven were superb last week. He then asked about City. He said, defensively, you were no problem, no issues at all. You've just said the same with Shaw and Botman. He said, but in the final third, you seemed a bit lacking. He went, yeah, 2 different games against Villa. We finished every chance. He says, but against more or less every chance, but against City, we just couldn't find a way past them. But he says, you've got to credit City, which is something I've said all week. Phil Foden in particular was absolutely superb. Lee, as always, when it's a home game, gets that quote in from Eddie about the crowd. And he went, tomorrow's going to be a big game. St. James's Park's going to be jumping. And he went, yeah, look, it's always such a powerful thing. He says, against Villa, the fans were amazing. And this was the line that most journalists picked up and used. He says, we need a red hot atmosphere on Sunday. Guy called Tom was next, another strange name. I'd not heard this guy before. All he asked was about Willock. He said, how's Willock doing? He goes, he's making good progress. He says he had a rescan on his hamstring a couple of days ago and there was no problems. He says he's had a bit of fatigue on his hamstring. He says, but hopefully we are on course for him to be back training during the international break and he'll be available and he's a big player for us. He then asked about Bruno. He says, is there anything you can do for training players on social media? He says, we're in a different generation. He says, it's part of a player's daily routine. He says, most of these players will have been on social media before they became professionals. And he says, we just have to, we have to get used to it as a football club. He says, when I was growing up, it wasn't there. He says, but he says, I think social media and training and stuff and how you react, maybe that's one for psychologists. There was a guy called Joe then. He says, there's lots of comparisons between Liverpool and yourselves. What do you think about that? He says, yeah. He says, we're both high intensity football teams. We're very proactive. We're positive. He said, I've said it before and I'll say it again. I'm a huge admirer of Jurgen Klopp and of his teams. I enjoy watching them play. They're always entertaining, and I can see the parallels between Liverpool and us. Ian Murta was next. He says, Ian said, Isaac announced himself now on the Premier League stage. Can he consider himself the number one striker, or is he still 50-50 with Callum Wilson? He paused, he smiled, and he just said, look, it's difficult to ever be able to call yourself the number one in a position. He says, I want players to earn the shirt every week. He says, there's always going to be another challenge each week. And he says, I always urge my players to start at 0 each week, which is a great philosophy. Do you know what I mean? It keeps everybody on their toes. I won't spoil it, but those of you who've watched episode 3 of the Newcastle United and Amazon documentary, it's a fascinating watch. And you hear Isaac and you hear Callum Wilson and you hear how they feel about the competition for a place last season. That gives you a bit of an insight into how the players are coping. Well worth a watch, though. Ian then said, with Callum not playing regularly, are you worried about potentially a team coming in and bidding for Callum Wilson before the end of the transfer window? He shook that one off. He just said, look, we need quality players in every position. He's going to get a lot of football. He's been top scorer, for us. He scored a lot of goals, and hopefully he's going to score a lot of goals this season with the football he plays and get a better total than last year. Jacob was next, went back in time and asked him how Nick Pope had reacted to the sending off last year, which, of course, as I mentioned earlier, cost him his place in the final. He said, look, it was one of those moments. It was a windy day. He says, but when he was sent off, he handled himself well. He says, afterwards, he made it about the team. He said it was a huge support for Karius. And, after the final, he helped us achieve our aims and, get to the Champions League. And he says, I guess his personal goal will be to try and get to a cup final this season. So it was a positive thing. He turned a negative into a positive. Jacob then said, well, is it positive that he wants to get to another final? He says, well, it may be on his mind day to day. But he says he just wants to perform for the best of us. He wants us to qualify for the Champions League again. He'll want us to get to a final. And he says, I hope we do get to a final because he deserves it. Jacob then said, all goalkeepers go through these kind of things, I guess. He says, yeah, look, it was just a moment in the season. He says, he had a really good season. His all-round game is good. He made some great saves and he played a big part, and he's a very positive influence in the dressing room. Martin Hardy was next. He said, why is the atmosphere between Liverpool and Newcastle so intense these days? And he goes, certainly over the last couple of seasons. And he went, is it? He says, I don't think it's been ramped up any more than it already has. He says, historically, it's a game that people want to watch. He said, but there's been incidents between you and the two, the two benches have had a pop at each other kind of thing. That was the kind of thing that Martin was trying to get at. Is it because, you're overtaking Liverpool? And he said, look, we just compete, we compete hard. He said it all, hasn't he, in the past? We just want to be the best we can be, and that was his reaction to Martin. Do you have a relationship with Klopp? Martin said, and he went, I don't have a relationship with any competitors. He says, I've always been like that. And where, what was the next one? He was going, competitiveness. That was his next question. He says, is this where we see your depth of competitiveness? Because you don't have a relationship with other managers. And he said, look, I was brought up with 3 brothers and a sister. I was always fighting for attention at home. He says, I used to create games at home and always wanted to win them. And he says, even when I'm playing games with my kids, there's no such thing as a friendly with me kids. I want to win and I want to compete. So we saw an interesting insight into Eddie Howe as a person, I think, with that particular answer. Kieran was next. He said, have the comments from Klopp over the last couple of years amused you? The technical area stuff, the ceiling quote, the quotes, etc. And he said, I wouldn't say I laugh. He says, other managers will have opinions about, us, and I've got no issues with that. I just roll with it. He then asked him about the Kevin Keegan moment, being slumped over the advertising hoardings in the infamous 4-3. Was this, was he a big influence for you? And he says, without a doubt. He says his legacy and his team's legacy, and their time at the club. He says the positive role models for me and for the team. And he says, I'm constantly reminded about the entertainers. So that was it. It was 34 minutes long again. It's getting longer, this press conference, but give us a good insight into him. I'll just come through your comments. Good morning, Les. Hope you're doing well. Good morning, JB. Good morning, Shez. Morning, John Askew. Hall looks total class. Looks as good going forward as he is further back. Fantastic option for the manager and could be vital for the last hour in games. And Ian says he watched a compilation video of Hall on YouTube. Looked amazing, literally leaving players on their backsides. Hall, Livramento, Isaac, Botman, Willock, Anderson, Miley, all young players. The future is definitely bright. Good morning, Blue Rhythm Boy. Chelsea fans are not happy he's left. That's a good sign. And Les says, the good thing about Hall being so young yet talented is his game time will need to be managed, given growth plates, etc., making him perfect for the rotation of the squad. And that's what I'm going on, Ian. Will Eddie give him game time, though? I'm sure he will. And the answer is probably yes, as technically it's a loan. I'm not sure we've made a better signing since the takeover. Interesting to hear everybody's thoughts in the chat. Nice to see you all interacting with each other. I'm going to head off now. And we do have the professionals tonight live at 6 o'clock. The shows will be all over the place for the next week or so because I want to try and do live shows for you. I know you appreciate the interaction. So professionals tonight at 6 o'clock. And then on Sunday night after the game, 8 till 9, I'll be doing the fans forum on Sunday. I'll update you about next week on Sunday night. But for now, have a good Saturday afternoon. Take care. And I will see you at 6 o'clock tonight.
We still do 7 NUFC Matters show a week for free. But if you want to help support NUFC Matters, then there are a few ways of doing it. Hit the like button on each live broadcast and video. This helps the channel grow. Hit the subscribe button and select the all notifications bell so you don't miss a single show. If you want to help us financially, then you can join the channel using this button with the membership starting at $1.99 a month. Or you can drop us a donation in the chat using a super sticker. We're also looking for sponsors. If you'd like your brand advertised on the flyers for the show and featured during the ad break, then email John at nufcmatters.com to arrange today.